just a second ago. Our topic today is the subject of prejudice and discrimination. So many illustrations and examples I could cite, both past and present, that illustrate and demonstrate why this is a thorny and difficult problem to reckon with. An example comes to mind from the Second World War, one that I often cite in the various classes that I teach here at the university. At the height of the Second World War, in 1944, a young man, a young Mexican-American, named Felix Longoria, was drafted to serve in the United States Army, and he was promptly sent overseas to the Pacific Theater of battle. Mr. Longoria was a young man in his late teens, was the father of a beautiful child, but he served with distinction. In fact, he won a number of medals of valor and the Medal of Honor for his service overseas, primarily in the Philippines. Tragically, Felix Longoria, this young man who served our country with distinction, was brutally slain by a Japanese sniper in the Philippines, lost his life. In the ensuing chaos and turmoil that followed the Second World War, Mr. Longoria's body would not be returned to the United States for another 4 years. His remains finally were returned to his home state of Texas in 1948. His family then, of course, wanted to bury Mr. Longoria, give him a decent burial. Unfortunately, no funeral home in his hometown of Three Rivers, Texas, was willing to bury him. Then his family discovered to their dismay that no funeral home in the entire state of Texas was willing to bury him. Because at that time, there was so much prejudice, so much hostility towards the Mexican-American population in the state of Texas, that it was simply looked upon as unthinkable that a Mexican-American war veteran would be given a decent burial. The Longoria family did not know what to do. Here they were with the remains of a fallen war hero, and they could not put him to rest. Thankfully, a United States senator from the state of Texas intervened and arranged for Mr. Longoria to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. To this day, his burial site is one of the most frequently visited burial sites in Arlington Cemetery. The United States Senator who made his burial at Arlington National Cemetery possible was then Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, who went on to become President of the United States during the 1960s and would eventually become the chief architect of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This illustration that I've cited is a rather good one of prejudice and discrimination and the potency that prejudice can have, the grip that it can have on even well-educated and otherwise sane and rational individuals. Of course, there are many contemporary examples that I could cite. A young lady named Bridget Ward comes to mind. In 1996, Bridget Ward, age 32, the mother of several young children, decided to relocate to a new neighborhood in the city of Philadelphia. She moved into the working class community of Bridesburg in northeast Philadelphia. She thought she had found a safe haven for herself and her young children. But unfortunately, Miss Ward was mistaken. Within 24 hours of moving into her new home in northeast Philadelphia, she found racist graffiti smeared all over her house. Then Confederate flags were displayed over her home. Then she began to receive death threats from unknown parties. And then various hoodlums began to surround her home and demand that she and her children leave the neighborhood immediately. Ultimately, after only 1 month in her new home, Miss Ward was forced to flee the neighborhood and flee for her life, as it turns out. This particular story caught the attention of the Philadelphia Inquirer and our national news media, I might add. Another rather stark example of prejudice in our society. One final example that comes to mind concerns my alma mater, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Back in 1995, alumni of Rutgers like myself were outraged when the president of Rutgers University made some rather imprudent and ill-considered public statements. The president of Rutgers, Francis Lawrence, was talking about standardized testing and SAT scores. And for reasons that remain unclear to me, President Lawrence made some comments about the performance of certain segments of the population on the SAT exams. Mr. Lawrence stated that some populations simply do not have the, quote, genetic hereditary background to score exceptionally well on such tests. Well, not surprisingly, the president's comments did not go over very well with the minority community on the Rutgers University campus, and he quickly had to retract his statements and apologize for them. His remarks gave rise to widespread protests and demonstrations on the Rutgers University campus. All of these examples and illustrations of the phenomenon of prejudice in our modern day society. In a book that I'm in the process of writing at the moment, a textbook dealing with prejudice, one of the arguments that I make is that prejudice is so widespread and so ubiquitous because there are so many diverse forces that can give rise to this phenomenon. There are so many different forces that can produce prejudice in our modern day society. I suppose that first off I should define this concept of prejudice. What do I mean by it? What do I mean when I use that term? In the book that I'm preparing, I define prejudice as an antagonistic and unconstructive attitude toward a distinguishable category of people based principally on their membership in that category. A hostile attitude towards a distinguishable category of people. So, for example, Professor Clyburn here could say, you know something, I just can't stand people who wear jeans. These kids right here, I detest them. Solely on the basis of their membership in this category of individuals who wear jeans. I'll disregard their GPAs, their personalities, their individual attributes, the fact that they might wear other garments aside from jeans on occasion. Solely on the basis of their membership in this category, I choose to have a hostile or antagonistic attitude towards them. One of the salient points about prejudice in our modern world is that we are all vulnerable to it. Anyone who claims otherwise is clearly misleading those around them or deceiving themselves. Prejudice, as we'll see for various psychological reasons, is something that we are all vulnerable to, regardless of our backgrounds or our ethnicity or our gender, etc., etc. There are a number of different psychological processes and tendencies that all human beings have that make us vulnerable to the phenomenon of prejudice. When talking about prejudice, generally speaking, scholars like myself focus on majority group prejudice. As students in my various diversity classes know, this is the emphasis of the various classes that I teach and other professors teach. Why do we focus on majority group prejudice? Well, let me explain first off what I mean by a majority group. In this particular room right now, as I always explain to students, I am the majority group. In every classroom that I instruct in, I'm the majority group. Because, generally speaking, the classroom instructor is the person with the power in the classroom. Students are relatively powerless vis-a-vis the professor. The professor determines the grades. The professor determines the attendance policy. The professor does most of the talking. Hence, the professor is the one who wields most of the power. Majority-minority has to do with power. It has to do with who wields the power. Hence, the professor in the classroom is the majority group. He may be outnumbered. You all, of course, could easily look my behind right now if you wanted to, or you could try anyway, because you heavily outnumber me. But the reality is, for all practical purposes, I wield the power in this classroom or in this room, and hence I am the majority group. This is what majority-minority is about. Who has the power? So when talking about prejudice, generally speaking, we focus on those who have the power. In the classroom, the professor has the power to discriminate, for example. I could easily choose to look at this student right now and say, I just don't like her, and give her a bad grade for no legitimate reason whatsoever, solely on the basis of my prejudice against her. I have this power. Students, generally speaking, do not possess such power. Hence, in the classroom, we would tend to focus on my prejudices as opposed to the prejudices of the students, because I wield the power. So when talking about prejudice or writing about the subject, generally speaking, we focus on the prejudice of a majority population or a majority group, the group that wields the most power. This is not to suggest that a minority population is not capable of prejudice in some way, shape, or form. This is not to say that students in the classroom do not have their own prejudices. Obviously, there are students who hate certain professors and detest certain administrators, but students, generally speaking, do not wield sufficient power to take action against those professors or against those administrators. So the reason that scholars like myself focus on majority group prejudice is because majority groups have the power. It is not because prejudice is limited to members of majority groups. All Americans are capable of succumbing to prejudice, but we don't all have the power to discriminate against other people in one way, shape, or form. One of the most dangerous aspects of the phenomenon of prejudice is the fact that it can escalate. And that often it can escalate even though we don't recognize that the escalation is taking place. Scholars generally agree that prejudice can escalate in certain stages. One well-known psychologist, Gordon Allport, in the 1950s, argued that prejudice can often begin with what he called anti-locution. What did he mean by anti-locution? Well, what Allport means are, say, ethnic jokes, or jokes or disparaging comments about another population, or another segment of the population. I could, in this classroom, start out by joking about students who wear jeans. You know, all those students that wear jeans, they get bad grades, they're frequently inebriated, intoxicated, they're drunk all the time, etc., etc. All kinds of stereotypes for which I have no empirical facts or evidence whatsoever. Oftentimes, prejudice begins with anti-locution, with jokes, disparaging comments, comments that we might not consider particularly dangerous or particularly deadly. But slowly but surely, prejudice can and often does escalate from anti-locution, that is, from disparaging comments, to other stages. Oftentimes, prejudice escalates from anti-locution to avoidance, frequently the second stage of prejudice. I started out by making jokes about students who wear jeans. Now I'll start distancing myself from them, start avoiding them. You know something? I think people who wear jeans are diseased. I think I'll just keep my distance out here. No telling where they've been. Keep your distance from them. Slowly but surely, anti-locution gives rise to avoidance, avoiding members of a particular population. Avoidance is often followed by an even more ominous stage. That is discrimination. Discrimination of one kind or another. I go from avoiding people who wear jeans to deciding not to hire or employ an individual who wears jeans, or not allowing someone who wears jeans to come into my restaurant or into my classroom, or giving, as I mentioned a moment ago, giving people who wear jeans a bad grade or a lousy score. I've gone from making jokes to avoiding a population to now openly discriminating against members of that population. Discrimination, tragically, is sometimes followed by physical attack, by violence of one sort or another. I've discriminated against these individuals who wear jeans, but you know something? My hostility towards them has now escalated. Now I just want to beat the living crap out of them. I've gone from discrimination to now committing hate crimes of one variety or another.